How good is this? Here we are at Megan on the banks of the river at Kuruldagan State Library. And this land was looked after by the Yagara people, the Turrbal people. And here we are in this beautiful, beautiful place with my friend Greg and Andrew Schulz. And it's really lovely to be able to be invited to be part of this discussion that we have today. So I'd like to acknowledge that we are on land that was cared for, looked after and nurtured by the people who were here all those years ago. The Turrbal people, the Yagara people. And those descendants of those people who are still in this land. Just not far from here is Musgrave Park. Many times I've been there for NAIDOC celebrations and other things, and it just shows that we are still connected, we're still here. So, nice to acknowledge that.
Yeah, thanks, Uncle Alan.
Thanks, Alan.
And Andrew Schulz and Uncle Alan Parsons are our two guests today on Walking Three Worlds, and I'm pleased to have Uncle Alan do our acknowledgement. He was our first guest in episode 1, audio only, and I thought I need to bring him in person so you can all get a look at this handsome young man, his Uncle Alan. And I've been very fortunate to meet him a number of years ago down at West End, or Garilpa. And here we are today with Uncle Alan and Andrew Schulz, who will explain why we've dragged him along today into our podcast. And I thought it'd be an interesting discussion. And I'll start it by sort of briefly introducing Alan and how I came about Andrew. I picked up this book and it came up online one day, and it was like Goondeen, Understanding Australia. It was a story of 3 Australians, Everald Compton, Uncle Albert Holt, and Henry Palaszczuk, who's the father of our current Premier, Anastasia. The author who collated this is Sophie Church. But the interesting thing, it's 3 men, and it attracted my attention because it is 3 walking 3 worlds, his 3 men giving 3 different instances of their what is Australia, who are Australians, and what is the meaning of Goondeen. So I dug deeper and found the man behind this book, who came together with another gentleman who he can mention. So maybe we can get some background off Andrew, where you're from, who's your mob, and how did this book come about, and how you met these 3 guys, and the idea behind it, and what you're doing now. How's that for a good start?
Well, it's a journey. It's part of the journey of understanding country and asking questions and getting no answers. So I'm a Yarrandali man. I was born in Yarrandali country. I've never ever met anyone from Yarrandali country.
Where is that?
Well, that's between Townsville and Mount Isa, around Hewenden. And we have the jump up, which is a very important landmark. And my parents were very keen for us to understand these important, significant districts of Bora and the protection of them. So when I was a very little fella, I understood that there were areas which had to be respected. But if you go back 3 or 4 generations, it could be that we were very much part of dispossession and looking at the way in which change occurred in Western Queensland. So if you go down to Longreach, you won't find very many Aboriginal people or recognition of Aboriginal issues. And then in Charleville, I was living in Charleville for quite some time, and then 50 years later I bumped into Alan Parsons, who was born in Charleville. And so
synchronicity.
we share some stories with people like Michael Connolly and Malcolm Connolly, his elder brother, Malcolm still lives in Charleville, and we would like to understand how they feel about country. So when we went to university. I was the only protagonist who just kept on digging. Do we have an Australian way of looking at architecture? And the answer was no. Do we have people studying First Nation people or sociology? I came across a lecturer called John Garcia who organised Oodgeroo Noonuckle, who was my first person to understand that her name Walker, Kath Walker, was not her real name. She discarded Kath Walker and Oodgeroo Noonuckle. So that was very significant to me, and her son Dennis and Lionel Fogarty and Gary Foley all came and talked to us. And so talk about opening eyes and understanding that there was a struggle. So I was about 20 then, 1920, and I understood that there was a struggle. But in terms of understanding what the struggle was about, that was going to come later.
Mm-hmm.
So the book Goondeen is a reaction. Bill Sennett and I worked on this thing called Year of the Outback in 2002. We formulated a strategy to introduce outback issues to the urban population. So we recognised there was 8 to 10 million Australians who had no idea of outback issues, who had absolutely zero understanding of First Nation issues or sovereign nation or protection of culture or importance of place. And so we never ever suggest that we speak on behalf of First Peoples. We speak with direction for non-Indigenous people to get a better understanding of protocols. And that's what that book's about.
And so you became an architect. That was your career.
Correct.
You're still an architect.
Still an architect.
Yes.
Still an architect, and totally flipped my way of thinking. Like when we went into architecture school, it was all about the form of the building. And now, because of my talking with people like Alan and others, it is place. I understand place and the sensitivities of place, and within place we then look at space. And so if we've got a technology issue, we would look at, and Alan would agree, that if you've got a technology that needs protection from wind, from rain, from the other elements, maybe you look at the way in which that would be housed or supplied electricity, but you don't put together the big photographic form and then look at the way in which it can be fitted out, which is the way in which many museums are dealt with. They built the form, they have an international competition, and then they go, well, what do we do now? We'll put something in it.
So that brings up a really good point, and one of the connections between the two of you and why I've got you to here, is talking about a vision that you saw, that you sort of mentioned out in Charleville, and that was an $8 million investment in a Outback Museum. And I think struck your interest because you thought, I wonder if they've approached the local people, First Nations people. And do you want to sort of unpack what you've discovered and what you've both been sort of realising?
Well, yes, Greg, and it's absolutely what Andrew was saying, is that oftentimes architects or people who get involved with these buildings, it's something that is important to see, that we need to put the horse before the cart and the cart before the horse. Mm-hmm. Because oftentimes they have these wonderful ideas about doing this and doing that, and then the resource that's available is people who maybe have university degrees, or they may have architectural degrees, or they may have some sort of document that says they've studied for X amount of years, but they have no connection to country. They have no connection to the history. That they may have a little bit of colonial history, but there's no ancestry of First Nations people, or as I like to say these days, the original people. And so that is often just glossed over or tokenistically sort of stuck in a corner somewhere to say, oh, aren't we good? We've done this and we've done that and we've ticked that box off, so we're really good people. That's totally, it's like, it really makes me infuriated to the point where that's where Andrew and we had a lovely conversation yesterday, and it was a point where I looked up all the website stuff about this proposed Outback Museum of Australia. Seriously? Well, where's the Outback begin and end? You know? Seriously, there's a lot of... It's very ambiguous and really, like, seriously... You know, anyway, I've got all these design plans and everything. They're still in draft form, and printed them out and gave them all to Andrew yesterday. And this is connected to a thing called the Cosmos Centre, which has been out at Charleville for quite a number of years. But again, there's almost nothing to celebrate and honour that, you know, original people knew about astronomy. They knew about seasons. They knew about how planetary alignments and all these sort of things dictated where they went to, where they moved to, what resource was available, and so on and so on and so on. No. They get these nice telescopes and they look at the moon and they look at this Saturn and they look at Pluto and they look at all these other things. Well, where's the connection to country? There's nothing really as a connection to country. So that's where Andrew and I have had this wonderful conversation about what can we possibly do with regard to this proposed building to incorporate a cultural aspect. So my country is Bidjira, and you look at the map, at Tyndale's map, here near there is Bidjira, but it follows the river down, and so we feel that Charleville is Bidjira country. So I have this connection. Not only was I born in Charleville, my grandmother and my mother lived in Charleville for quite some time. Andrew's spent some time out there, and here's this perfect opportunity for us to collate all this together, to have a voice, to have something to say about what goes on in that place.
Yeah, so this museum should represent the deeper, longer narrative than just a museum of colonial settler history. You know, you're talking about incorporating the ancient technology that was known by the original people of the land and how they looked after country. Way back when I was reading some of the settlers' stories about coming to Australia, and they tended to stick to the coastline because they found going to this harsh environment, they didn't think anyone would live out there. And, you know, here there were thriving tribes and mobs probably out there navigating it for, 100,000 years or more, quite comfortably through all the droughts and the rain and, following the water lines, the waterways. How do you think, and what's just playing around with this, but what do you think would be a good idea for this museum to end up looking like for people? You know, when people come from overseas, they turn up at Charleville, what would be something that would be really inspiring?
What's inspiring is if you go to Desert Park at Alice Springs, okay, you fly in and you see the McDonnell Ranges, West McDonnell Ranges, and you drive in and you go through the gap into the township, and then you go out to the exhibition centre, and then you go into the theatre, and at the end of the show, the curtains open, just like we're looking out over here, and they open up and there's the McDonnell Ranges. And everyone goes, wow, isn't that great? Like, there's the McDonnell Ranges in a European frame. So the designers of Desert Park sought the advice of European architects to put together this thing, a theatre that opens the curtains and there's the McDonnell Ranges. But they're assuming that you don't see the McDonnell Ranges when you fly in. They're assuming you don't see them as you pass through them. They're assuming that the eye can't understand the landscape. Okay, so what we would look at in terms of the country, a facility representing country, would be always was, always will be. And so we would like to go forward 100 years and say, this is Bidjira in 100 years from now. This is country over the last 100,000 years. And that the people who fly in from New York or Frankfurt or UK come and actually start to understand this continent, how it relates to people, how the stars relate to people, how the songlines relate to people, the culture, we call it the long history and the rich culture. And the identity of the nation is revealed within the exhibit, the identity of the nation. So rooms without walls, the sounds of the silence, the nighttime sounds, the sounds of the wind, the utilisation of fire, the storytelling and the humour. I think you must always include humour and the.
That's beautiful. And as you're telling me that, and I'm seeing artificial intelligence, 3D. I'm seeing the projection type use of technology to highlight and taking people back into time travel, not unlike the work of the virtual songlines.
I'd like to share a story that was in total harmony with what you're saying, Andrew. This was told to me by a fellow named Uncle Tex Chapman. He's a Waka Waka fella. And Tex lived in Caboolture for quite a while. That's where I have a house. And it turned out that his wife knew all my relatives who were taken to Cherbourg, so we got a connection. But Tex told me this story, which I remember clearly, and I think it's absolutely relevant. And he was a person who spent a lot of time out in the bush, and he told me this story. He was with these other blokes, about 3 of them, and they had horses, and they'd gone out and I don't know what they were doing exactly. I would have suggested they're trying to find clean skin cows or something. Anyway, so they're out on this place, and this huge lightning thunderstorm comes through, crashing and bashing, and the horses all got spooked, and they takes off. Whoa! And these men wake up, and they put the saddles on the ground, but the horses are gone. They're gone. And so it's like, Anyway, after the shock of these horses running away, it's kind of like, right, okay, let's just got the fire going, it's all right. So they slept on it. And the other people with Tex were Europeans. Bushcraft, yes, but they had the mentality was geared towards this European way of thinking. Anyway, they're getting all anxious and how are we going to get all this anxiety? And Tex said, just hang on a minute. So in the stillness of that land, right on dusk, no campfire going, no external noises, listening. I think the word is Bidjira, which is called deep listening.
Yep, to the hurry.
We've got some visitors in the background, but that's all right. Add to the excitement. And so Tex said, listen, really, really listen. So in that stillness, way off in the distance, they could hear the frogs. Very soft. Very soft. Just sure. So orientation, that way. So just about, long before dawn, got the saddles and they started walking in that direction. And they started walking, and I don't know how far they walked, but they got to a certain point, and then it got too hot, so they stopped and waited again till the evening time and had another listen. Yes, that's the direction. Took them 4 days, and they got there's a waterhole and there's the horses.
Well, we call that knowledge of country.
Well, that's exactly the point, and so that's what we were talking about, is with regard to setting up a showcasing or a facility that would really incorporate something like that to show that deep connection to country, to the land, to the animals, to everything that is part
To
and
the
packaged.
sounds, to the, everything.
Exactly,
all the
Greg,
different-
exactly.
All the senses.
And so you're using all the senses, but more than that, you are connecting to country.
Yeah.
More than anything, you are connecting to country. And so by doing that, those men found the water, found the horses, and were here to tell the story.
Yeah. So, in terms of your background and the involvement of elders, the Bidjira elders would be involved with the museum, with the facility on a daily basis.
Well, it's. I mean, and you and I, Andrew, have had a very brief discussion around this. That point, that part. Is that interfering?
No. Your voices are much louder.
Good.
It's just background noise.
Okay. Is
He
it
can
going to
edit that out,
detract?
so we can, noise reduction.
Good.
Yeah.
So your question, Andrew, is that, well, let's, it's absolutely something that could be investigated further, and so you and I have talked about writing letters to the people, the mayor and the council of Charleville, and I showed you yesterday the draft letter that I had drawn up.
Very nice.
And I'm working on that one.
So just on that point, for our listeners who are listening to this, we'll put up a copy of that letter, and people can choose to take a variation of that and
That
probably
would be
support
wonderful,
you.
Greg.
And then they come and support you by sending a letter of support to the mayor.
That would be great.
Now, is this a local initiative or is it federally funded,
It's
the
a
museum?
Federal.
There's
The
federal
allocation
and
of funds comes from
state.
federal. Is it
Yeah.
state as well?
I think the state is involved. With Little Proud was there involved.
Yeah, but he's a federal man.
Okay.
So we'll have that all on our website, and we'll get people that can help and hear these sort of concerns can jump in, and because the more letters they get about this concern, the more they will address having consultation with the original people of that land.
Well, yes, Greg, and I think that the momentum is building to have more inclusion
Yes.
with regard to what the people who ancestors and those of us who are living today. We need to have a voice.
Yes.
We need to have a voice. And I've got this shirt on today. This is Statement of the Heart shirt, and it says voice, treaty and truth. Right? And so the voice is what we're doing. A treaty is something that we're working on. But truth-telling is so important and so necessary. And it really does highlight, you gave a discussion with Ray Kirkhoff, and Ray was able to talk about the truth of the resistance of those that came into this land.
Yes.
And that truth is so important to be told.
Yes.
And not glossed over or dramatised or
Sensationalised or all.
sensationalised
Yeah.
and all this, but so it's kind of really important that when we talk about a construction of an $8-point-something million edifice in the place of Charleville, that to be included in that must be a cultural recognition of that connection to that land by the Bidjira people. And so that's where you and I, Andrew, had this discussion previously about what can we do, what is possible. And so the wheels are in motion, and I really appreciate you, Greg, inviting us to come along today to have this yarn up. And absolutely, if we put it out there, and as you suggest, other people go, yes, yes.
I see that museum project something that can celebrate, our First Nations and their culture, and it could also celebrate those first migrants that would have worked out in that area. Whether it was the farmers or whether it was the people doing what they were doing, regardless of judgment on what they were doing, rightly or wrongly. And then the new migrants, those that are living there today, to celebrate that. But anyway, maybe we could have some influence. But I wanted to touch on this as well. Goondeen, the book, and Andrew runs a Facebook page called Understanding Australia, which is worth checking in on and liking and following that page, because Andrew puts up a lot of interesting tidbits from all around the country.
He certainly does.
Yeah, activities to get you thought-provoking. A lot around the waterways, particularly the Murray-Darling.
Yeah.
You have a passion around that. But let's not sidetrack with that. But the book itself, how did it come about, and why did you pick these three gentlemen,
Right.
three older Australians, and also when is the next book coming out with the three women?
Yes.
Okay.
So the starting point of a solution was recognition that the three men were forcibly removed from their homes as young people.
So Henry Palaszczuk?
Henry Palaszczuk was forced out of Poland. So we heard Ray and his family's moving on forcibly. Everald at Linville up in the Brisbane Valley. The state government closed the economic life of the township, and they were forcibly removed out of that district.
Yep.
And Uncle Albert, he was a freewheeling kid up near Springshaw on the Dawson River, and they were packed up and moved to Baramba. Now Baramba is now known as Cherbourg.
The mission.
And yes, and so within Cherbourg and Baramba there were 47 different groups, language groups. Okay, so a Goondeen was the person who rose up to give people hope, so that you had all this, let's say, likely forced violations, where the superintendent would pit people against each other, and they would create conflict. Well, the Goondeen was the person who found the right words to give hope and to give comfort.
Sounds like a wise fella.
A very wise man, in that every society needs one, but not every society, every language group would recognise the person or their background.
Yes.
And so they had to find those right words to give people, let's say, the reason to live, or the reason to go on, or the future of their children.
So what language, do you know what mob it came from? What clan?
Well, it doesn't belong to a clan. It was invented through the Murray group in Cherbourg.
Okay.
So it has a meaning from the 1860s.
Yep.
It didn't necessarily exist before that within any one of the clans, because there was no need. So if you are locked up in a German prisoner of war camp, and there's all different people from different backgrounds, and someone rises up in order to allow people to want to see the next sunrise, that person has a special place in that forced camp or labour camp. Now, what we don't understand is how any human could do these things to another human. So what we're attempting to do within Goondeen is firstly to give recognition and understanding. Daderi was a word that Alan just used before, deep listening. So in terms of care, share, respect, if you are able to listen, you are then respecting. you understand what the other person is thinking. So in the Queensland Parliament, there was absolutely zero consultation with the people who the laws segregated, our segregation laws, our divisions, our rape and pillage of the peoples are all within that book. And very few people know that the German government in the mid-1930s sent a delegation here to Queensland to study the Queensland segregation laws. And it's all included in the files called the Azimuth files, where they went and took that local law, local government law, and then imposed it on the minority groups of Europe.
And I heard that also from Queensland was part of the South African influence of apartheid had come from its learning of what had occurred in Queensland. Is that, did you hear any of that?
There's two separate, like about 4 generations apart.
Yes.
So the South African apartheid system came long after the Second World War in South Africa, after the Boer War.
Yep.
And but the Queensland system of segregation and let's say lack of human rights was activated long before 1830, 1850, 1860, 1870, and what I find very hard to articulate is that election after election after election, the people went and kept on voting for those policies. And it wasn't until 1967 when the referendum came in, the leaders of Aboriginal groups were then finding the strength to come forward and saying, this is my country, this is my language, this is what I want to give hope to my children. And that's only 2 generations.
That's right.
Only 2 generations of rising up and putting forward that point of view. So I believe anyone interested in the topic, as a non-Indigenous person, we can just simply say, wow, this is fantastic stuff. Like hundreds of thousands of years of culture, all these different language groups. You know, like I've heard Max Stewart talk in his language in Alice Springs, and what a beautiful language. And then he is put before the courts, falsely charged in regard to murder, and he couldn't put 2 English words together, and he was crippled as a person because they suggested that he wasn't fluent or he wasn't capable.
Educated or civilised.
And so he sat in jail for 10, 15 years, and then they released him without charge, no charge. And they're the sorts of inequalities that people have been facing. So this book brings out a number of those issues and how we deal with them.
Well, you addressed a lot of topics, and I heard you say earlier before we started that you asked something like 90 something questions, and you had to narrow it down.
Bill and I had up to 90 topics, and when Sophie Church got to 25 topics, we said, let's print, let's go. So it was published.
I think it's worth a read to a lot of people who, you know, this is all about truth-telling and sharing. And look, it's just another piece of a jigsaw puzzle to get this book into your psyche and understand these Goondeens' versions of their, you know, their own journey and their life, and how you've sort of put it together as a jigsaw puzzle. You know, and a lot of these things like Australia is whose.
Well, that's right.
You know, Australia is a defender of freedom. Australia is an immigration nation. Australia is a closed mind. So these are the topics, you know, Australia.
So if you take that phrase, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So the first peoples are the custodians of the land, and everyone else, including the convicts, are citizens of the globe.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're all here, and we seek acknowledgement of the elders and their thoughts in regard to how they can either embrace us
Yep.
or tell us to move on, and we then acknowledge those elders. Now, if you start from that position and you listen to what is being said, it's all about healing, and it's all about your own wellness.
Yes. That's very, very good. Very, very good. So I do recommend people get a copy of this. You'll find this online or at all the Amazons and so on.
Good bookshops.
Good bookshops. Now, when is the female version of this coming out?
Well, there's no dates.
No.
There's no writer.
Yes.
We're going through a process of consolidation.
Yes.
And to understand how the if you really look at those programs in Canberra about bad behaviour in the Parliament, you'll understand our hesitancy
Yes.
to move on without let's say embracing how women and their role in Australian society will emerge.
Yes.
And so we're just sort of redefining many of the, let's say, powerful positions that women will take, can take, have taken, and then develop those 90 odd topics.
Fabulous.
On that topic, it's perfectly, you put that really well with regard to where the political framework sits at this point of our journey. On a cultural level, when the English came, one of the very first things that they did was they took the weapons off the men, they disarmed the men so they were not in a position to defend family or defend those that was given their responsibility to. And Ray Kirkhope, he talked a lot about a resistance to that, you know, where people knew the country very well, and they used that knowledge of country to defend the country, but also to look after culture, to look after the established situation, which was this is country that was given to us, or we have custodianship over. And so you try to intrude into that, well, we're going to defend that. And so that's what happened. However, when you take the weapons off the men, when you chain them like dogs and put them on concentration camps, also known as missions, you're devaluing those people to the point where they don't have identity, they don't have a sense of worth, they don't have, and so this precipitated a whole downwards spiral into hopelessness and people who just felt they had no opportunity to have a voice even. And so to the credit, the women stepped into the circle, right? And the women kept, as I say, the fire burning, you know, and so credit must be given, and I do honestly, sincerely, deeply honour the women who took on that position of defending language, defending stories, defending, nurturing children, and so on and so on and so on. However, I feel very strongly we're in this shift of where the men can begin to take back that role that was taken from them. And one of the catalysts, if I can share this briefly, and people might like to look it up, is the returning of the Star of Taroom stone. And Taroom, by the way, is not far from Carnarvon Gorge, which is where my grandfather's people were. And Taroom is a town where my mother and my grandmother were both born. So, and so I was there for the returning of this Star of Taroom.
Which segues us into
fantastic.
another episode coming up where we're going to talk to you and some other guests about that whole journey of the Star of Taroom.
It's really important, Greg, because oftentimes you get these triggers or these occurrences or this energy that rises up that then creates a dynamic of this is the pathway that we need to go on. And so meeting Andrew and talking about wanting to see if we can do something with Charleville with this museum set up and everything, we've got things in place, and so we're working on that. Only met yesterday for the very first time, so yes, it's exciting that we're living in this period of re-emerging of a voice, re-emerging of a dynamic of truth-telling. And with that, yeah, there's a thing like a treaty, but I think it's more than just a treaty. It's about a knowledge sharing space. And that means that we'll all become involved with that.
Yeah, here. Look, I think we might thank you both for coming on the show and
Thank you.
having your wisdom shared with our listeners. Thank you to my two brothers here, and have a wonderful, wonderful week. Thank you.